Ethan walked into that moment like a man who had already written the ending in his head, and that is what made it so hard to watch, because he was not walking toward a conversation. He was walking toward a dream he still believed he could save, while Teegan stood there with the kind of distance that tells you the other person has already lived through the ending before you even arrived. He wanted warmth, but she gave him space, and not the soft kind of space that still leaves room for hope, but the kind that feels like a wall you only notice after you hit it, because Ethan seemed to believe that if he showed enough effort, if he proved he cared enough, if he made one move big enough to cut through all the silence, then maybe Teegan would see him differently and remember why they were close in the first place. But Teegan did not look like someone waiting to be convinced. She looked like someone who had already done the emotional work in private, already cried, already questioned herself, already replayed the good moments, already weighed them against the bad ones, and already reached a place Ethan was only now trying to enter. That is why this did not feel like a normal breakup scene. It felt like two people standing in the same room, but living in two completely different timelines, because Ethan was still in the part where love could be repaired with effort, while Teegan seemed to be in the part where effort no longer changed what the relationship had cost her. And that is the painful part viewers could feel without anyone needing to say it out loud. Ethan was not just trying to win Teegan back. He was trying to win back the feeling of being chosen. The feeling that maybe after Olivia, after the divorce, after all the emotional weight he carried around like it was normal, someone could still look at him and decide he was worth staying for. That kind of need can make a person move fast, and it can make a big gesture feel brave from one side and overwhelming from the other. Because to Ethan, this may have felt like proof that he was finally fighting for something. But to Teegan, it may have felt like pressure, like he was asking her to become the answer to pain she did not create and could not fix. And that is where the whole story starts to twist. Teegan's coldness may not have been hate. It may have been protection. There is a big difference between wanting to hurt someone and refusing to reopen a door that took too much strength to close, and the more you watch her reaction, the more it feels like she was not trying to punish Ethan. She was trying not to get pulled back into a pattern that already taught her what it felt like to lose herself. Ethan kept looking for a sign, a softer look, a small smile, a pause long enough to become hope, anything he could turn into a reason to keep trying. But Teegan did not give him that comfort, and that silence said more than a long speech ever could. The rejection was not loud, and that made it worse. It was quiet enough to feel final. And maybe that is what Ethan did not see coming, because he thought the problem was distance, but the real problem may have started long before he ever tried to win her back. At first, Ethan's move looked like the kind of thing reality TV wants people to call romantic, because he was not just sitting back, he was taking action. He was trying to close the distance. He was trying to prove that Teegan still mattered, and on the surface, that can look like a man finally fighting for the person he says he does not want to lose, but the deeper you look at it, the more uncomfortable it becomes, because a big move is not always the same thing as emotional growth. Sometimes a big move is just panic with better timing. Ethan seemed to believe that showing up would say everything he had not been able to explain, and that is where the problem started, because when someone has already felt confused, tired, or emotionally pushed too far, a surprise does not always feel sweet. It can feel like the other person is asking for a reaction before they have earned back trust. That is what makes the Wisconsin move feel so complicated. From Ethan's side, it may have felt brave, like he was finally doing something instead of hiding inside his own silence. But from Teegan's side, it may have felt like the same old issue wearing a new outfit, because if the relationship already broke under the weight of poor communication, then showing up with more intensity does not fix the missing clarity. It only makes the moment heavier. And by the time the Montana trip entered the picture, the tension had already changed shape, because now this was not just Ethan and Teegan trying to figure out what they were. This was a broken connection being carried into a family setting, with opinions around them, history around them, cameras around them, and expectations pressing into every quiet pause. That kind of pressure can make even a simple answer feel impossible. Ethan wanted a response that would tell him there was still hope, but Teegan seemed to want space that did not come with an emotional bill attached, and those two needs were moving in opposite directions because he was trying to pull the story closer while she was trying to keep herself from getting pulled back in. And that is where viewers have to slow down before they call it cold. Teegan may not have been rejecting the effort itself. She may have been rejecting the pressure behind it. There is a difference between someone trying harder and someone finally understanding what went wrong. And Ethan's mistake may have been thinking those two things were the same, because effort can be loud, effort can be visible, effort can make a great scene, but consistency is quieter, and consistency is what usually makes someone feel safe enough to come back. Ethan's past wounds were still standing in that room with them, even if nobody wanted to name them directly. And when someone has been through divorce, loss, family tension, and emotional isolation, the desire to fix one relationship can become bigger than the relationship itself. That is when love starts getting tangled with fear. And maybe that is what Teegan sensed. Maybe she did not see a man who had solved the problem. Maybe she saw a man who was terrified of losing one more person. And that makes the whole situation sadder, because Ethan may have been trying to prove devotion, while Teegan may have been watching the same pattern repeat with more emotion and less stability. The moment Teegan did not soften, viewers split into two camps, and both sides thought they were seeing the real story. The moment Teegan did not soften, the whole story split in two, because some viewers looked at Ethan and saw a man who was hurt, confused, and still trying to hold onto the one thing that made him feel like his life was not falling apart again, while other viewers looked at Teegan and saw a woman who had already given enough, already stepped back, already made her choice, and did not owe him a warmer version of goodbye just because he finally showed emotion in front of everybody. That is why this situation became so tense so quickly, because it was never just about whether Ethan deserved another chance. It was about what people think rejection is supposed to look like when the person being rejected is visibly hurting. Some people wanted Teegan to be softer because Ethan looked broken, and that reaction makes sense on a human level, because when someone looks wounded, we naturally start searching for the person who can make it hurt less. But that does not mean Teegan was responsible for fixing the pain her answer created. And it definitely does not mean distance is the same thing as cruelty. This is where the obvious story starts to fall apart. Ethan's effort was easy to see. Teegan's boundary was harder to enjoy. And that matters, because audiences often reward the person who makes the bigger gesture, even when that gesture comes late, even when it creates pressure, even when the other person has already been quietly surviving the damage for longer than anyone realized. A grand move looks emotional. A boundary looks cold. That is the unfair part. Teegan's silence may have felt harsh, but it also may have been the clearest thing she could give him, because if she smiled too much, paused too long, or gave him even one soft opening, Ethan might have treated that as proof that the door was still cracked open, and maybe she knew that better than anyone watching from the outside. So then the question changes. Was Teegan being cold, or was she finally being clear? Because those are not the same thing, even though people love to mash them together when a woman refuses to perform comfort for a man who is already upset. And on Ethan's side, sympathy is real, but sympathy can also hide accountability. Because yes, he seemed heartbroken. Yes, he seemed sincere. And yes, he looked like someone trying to repair what he lost. But trying does not automatically mean listening, and wanting someone back does not automatically mean understanding why they left. That is where the emotional divide gets sharper. Maybe Ethan mistook access for progress. Maybe because Teegan was still around, still speaking, still sharing space in this messy Plath world, he thought there was still a path back to what they had. But being near someone does not mean they are emotionally available, and being polite does not mean they are secretly waiting. That is the part viewers miss when they only focus on who looks more hurt. Pain is visible on Ethan. Teegan's exhaustion is quieter. And reality TV loves visible pain because it makes better scenes, better reactions, better comments, and better arguments online, because apparently watching two people fail to communicate is now a national hobby with commercial breaks. But the deeper question is whether this relationship was already over before the show made it look unresolved. Teegan may have known the ending long before Ethan accepted it, and if that is true, then the rejection was not the beginning of the breakup. It was only the moment Ethan finally had to hear what her behavior had already been saying. But once Kim and the family orbit moved closer to the breakup, the story stopped being just about two exes and started becoming a pressure test. The hardest part was not just that Teegan rejected Ethan, it was that she rejected him in a space where everyone could feel the tension, because a private breakup already hurts enough. But when that same breakup starts moving through a family trip, through side comments, through cameras, through people watching every little reaction, the pain changes shape and turns into something heavier than heartbreak. Ethan was not only dealing with the fact that Teegan did not give him the answer he wanted, he was dealing with the public weight of trying, hoping, stepping forward, and then having that hope sit there in the open with nowhere to hide. That is a different kind of embarrassment. It is one thing to hear no when nobody else is around, but it is another thing to hear it when the whole atmosphere knows you came in wanting a yes. And that is where Ethan's face, his silence, and his energy started to tell a bigger story than his words ever could. He looked like a man who was not only losing Teegan, he looked like a man losing the fantasy that one brave move could fix the damage. And on Teegan's side, the pressure was just as real, but in a different way, because she was not only trying to hold a boundary with Ethan, she was trying to hold it while everyone else had an opinion about how soft, how kind, how open, or how forgiving she should be. That is where people get unfair. They see someone set a hard boundary and immediately start asking why it could not be warmer, but sometimes warmth is the exact thing that creates confusion. And if Teegan already knew she did not want to go back, then the clearest thing she could do was not give Ethan a softer version of hope just to make the room feel less awkward. Her strongest move may have been refusing to over-explain. Because the more she explained, the more room there was for negotiation, and Ethan was clearly looking for any small sign he could turn into progress. That is what made the power shift so obvious. Ethan could keep trying, but Teegan controlled access now, and once someone controls access, the emotional balance changes completely, because one person is reaching and the other person is deciding whether the door opens at all. And that is why the fallout felt so exposed. This was not just rejection. This was Ethan being forced to sit inside the consequence of hoping out loud. The deeper question is whether Ethan finally understood Teegan's boundary, or whether he mostly felt the humiliation of being unable to change her answer, because those are not the same thing, and the difference matters. Understanding a boundary means accepting it even when it hurts. Feeling embarrassed by rejection can make someone focus more on the pain of losing than on the reason the other person pulled away. And that is where Ethan's unresolved pain became impossible to ignore, because this breakup started looking less like a random romantic failure and more like a mirror held up to everything he still had not fully processed. The divorce, the family tension, the loneliness, the difficulty expressing what he feels. All of it seemed to follow him into this moment with Teegan, and suddenly the real question was no longer whether she would take him back. The real question was why he needed her answer so badly. And that is when the real question finally becomes impossible to avoid. Was Ethan fighting for Teegan, or fighting the fear that everyone eventually leaves? And this is where the whole story finally becomes clear, because Ethan did want Teegan back. There is no real mystery there. His actions showed it, his energy showed it, and the way he kept reaching for some kind of emotional opening showed it even more. But wanting someone back is not the same thing as becoming the kind of person they feel safe enough to return to. That is the part that makes Teegan's rejection feel bigger than one cold moment. She did not need to hate him to walk away. She only needed to believe that going back would cost her peace. And when you look at it that way, her distance stops looking like random cruelty and starts looking like a decision she probably had to make before Ethan was ready to hear it, because Teegan was not reacting to one conversation, one surprise, or one emotional attempt. She seemed to be reacting to a pattern, and patterns are harder to forgive than moments because patterns teach people what to expect next. Ethan may have hoped that one strong move could prove he was serious, but Teegan seemed to be measuring something quieter. She was not only watching what he said, she was watching whether the emotional safety was actually there. That is why the gesture did not work, because the problem was never just effort. The problem was trust, timing, and the feeling that if she stepped back in, she might end up carrying the same weight all over again. And that is the painful truth behind the rejection. Ethan's pain was real, but so was Teegan's boundary. He was not some heartless villain chasing attention, and she was not some cold person trying to embarrass him. They were two people standing on opposite sides of the same failed connection, with Ethan still hoping the story could restart, and Teegan acting like the ending had already happened. The coldest part was not even that she rejected him. The coldest part was that Ethan could not control the ending anymore. He could show up, he could try, he could explain, he could hope. But he could not make Teegan feel what she no longer felt. And that is the moment where love stops being a speech and becomes acceptance. Because maybe Ethan was not only fighting for Teegan. Maybe he was fighting the fear that one more person had decided life felt lighter without him in it. That is a brutal thing to sit with, and it explains why the scene felt so heavy. Because the rejection did not just close a romantic door, it forced Ethan to face the possibility that love cannot rescue him from the work he still has to do inside himself. And for Teegan, walking away may have been the only way to stop repeating a story that looked emotional from the outside but felt exhausting from the inside. So no, this does not prove Teegan hated Ethan. It proves she chose distance. It proves Ethan's big move was not enough. And it proves that sometimes the most painful rejection is not the one that destroys love, but the one that reveals love was never strong enough to fix what emotional avoidance kept breaking.